The highway was eerily quiet, save for the dull hum of tires slicing through the wet asphalt. The rain fell in sheets, painting the road in slick layers of silver and gold under the dying light of the setting sun. The storm had caught everyone off guard, but even as the thunder rumbled in the distance, the traffic moved on, heedless, indifferent, and unforgiving. Cars sped past, their drivers glancing but not stopping. Not one dared to pull over on the empty stretch of road. And then, out of nowhere, there was a man. Exhausted, worn down by the weight of his own life, he slammed on his brakes. His truck skidded a little on the wet surface before coming to a jarring halt. Jack Rivers, a single father, hadn't expected this. He had no idea what lay ahead. The wreckage in front of him was like a nightmare materializing out of thin air. The biker lay motionless on the side of the road, his motorcycle twisted beyond recognition, a heap of mangled steel and shattered glass. It was a scene Jack had seen only in war zones, the kind of wreck that made even the strongest men hesitate. The motorbike was half buried in the roadside ditch, smoke still rising from the ruined engine, its rider completely still. Jack stared at the scene for a long moment, his mind clouded by exhaustion, but there was something about the helplessness of it all that ignited a fire inside him. He had always believed in the quiet acts of bravery, the ones no one saw but everyone remembered. And today once again he would be that man. He had no second thoughts. He couldn't. He threw open the truck door and stepped into the rain, the cold immediately soaking through his jacket. His boots splashed through the growing puddles as he sprinted toward the wreck. The world around him seemed to blur in the downpour, but the biker, the man who lay in the mud, alone and broken, became his only focus. "Stay with me," Jack whispered, kneeling beside the man. His voice was steady, controlled, but beneath it, his heart raced in his chest like a drumbeat. He felt the sharp sting of adrenaline in his veins. The smell of gasoline filled his nostrils, mixing with the fresh, metallic scent of blood. There was no time to think, no time for anything other than saving this man. His hands trembled as he pressed his jacket against the biker's side, trying to staunch the bleeding. The blood soaked through his worn jacket quickly, and he couldn't help but think of his daughter, asleep back at home. What would she wake up to if something happened to him? But Jack didn't hesitate. He couldn't. Not while there was someone to save. As he held the biker in place, the minutes stretched into eternity. The rain seemed to fall harder, the world around him blurring into a haze of wet chaos. He could barely hear anything over the pounding of his own pulse in his ears. "Please hold on," Jack muttered under his breath, willing the man to live, willing the rain to stop for just a second so he could catch his breath. But the rain continued to fall, cold and unforgiving, and the sound of the storm filled his ears like a roaring river. Finally, the wail of sirens cut through the storm. The paramedics arrived, a blur of red and flashing lights. They moved swiftly, lifting the biker into the ambulance without a word, leaving Jack standing there, soaked to the bone, alone in the aftermath of his decision. No one asked for his name. No one thanked him. But Jack didn't care. He had done what he felt needed to be done. As the ambulance drove away, disappearing into the rain, Jack stood there in the middle of the empty road, his body shivering, his thoughts distant. He didn't need any recognition. All he needed was the quiet knowledge that, for once, he had made a difference. The rain didn't let up as Jack sat in his truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes unfocused as they gazed at the empty road ahead. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside him. He had been a father for 5 years, but in many ways he had felt like he was always playing catch-up, like he had never quite learned how to balance the weight of everything on his shoulders. Jack Rivers was a man who had lived through the hardest of times. He knew the brutal weight of loneliness, the silence that filled the spaces around him when he tried to sleep, the ache of wanting to be somewhere else, somewhere better for his daughter. Every day was a fight. He worked 2 jobs, always just scraping by, and he did it all for her. Mornings were the hardest. His daughter Emma would wake up early, eager to start the day, her innocent smile lighting up the room. But Jack could never shake off the exhaustion that clung to him, the quiet fatigue that permeated every part of his body. He was used to it though. The days had blurred together for so long that the exhaustion no longer felt like something he could get rid of. It was simply part of him, like the tired lines on his face or the calluses on his hands. Every night, after working long hours at the construction site and then doing late-night shifts at the convenience store, Jack would go home to Emma. He'd tuck her into bed, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face as she drifted off to sleep. Then, in the quiet of the night, when the house was still and the world seemed to sleep, Jack would sit by himself in the dim light of the kitchen, sipping coffee or just staring at the wall. He often wondered if he was doing enough, if he was enough. His mind would wander back to the times he had been in the military. Those were the days he tried not to think about. The days when he had witnessed things no one should ever have to see, when the bonds formed in battle were deeper than anything he had experienced in civilian life. And yet, those bonds were as broken as everything else. Jack never spoke of his time in the military. He didn't need to. The scars were there, hidden beneath his tired eyes and quiet demeanor, but the pain was not something he was ready to share. He had learned early that being strong didn't mean talking about your pain. It meant carrying it alone, enduring. That was what he had learned when he lost his wife, Emma's mother, after a long battle with illness. She had passed away when Emma was just a baby, and Jack had been left to raise her on his own. There were no supports, no safety nets. Just Jack and Emma against the world. But even though he never spoke of it, the pain was always there, lurking in the background. Every time he looked at his daughter, he was reminded of the promises he had made to be there for her, to protect her, to give her a life filled with love and safety. And yet, every day felt like a race against time, trying to keep up, trying to make ends meet. As Jack sat in the truck, the weight of everything was crushing him. He had always managed to hold it together, but moments like this, moments where he had to confront the reality of what he had become, shook him to his core. He had saved a stranger today, a man whose life was shattered in an instant, a man who didn't even know his name. And yet, Jack had made a choice. He had acted without hesitation, without thought for himself. It was what he had been trained to do in the military, what he had promised himself he would always do, step in when no one else would. But it wasn't easy. Even now, as he sat alone in the truck, his mind replayed the images of the biker lying there, bleeding out in front of him. The sound of the rain had muffled everything else, but the weight of the man's body in his hands had been enough to leave a mark on Jack. It wasn't something you could forget. The responsibility of life and death, the power of one person's actions, was heavy. At that moment, Jack realized something profound. He wasn't just a man trying to survive. He wasn't just a father struggling to provide. He had become something more, something he hadn't recognized until now. He had the power to change the world, even if it was just one moment at a time. Maybe he couldn't fix everything, couldn't make everything right, but he could make a difference. And that realization was enough to keep him going, enough to fuel him for another day. The truck's engine sputtered as Jack started it, pulling out of the spot. The rain had turned into a light drizzle, and the world outside seemed quieter, more peaceful. He could see the glow of his house in the distance, the soft light from the porch casting a warm, inviting hue against the wet pavement. The storm had passed, and in that moment he realized something he had missed for so long. There was always hope, even after the darkest of storms. When Jack pulled into the driveway, his daughter came running out the door, her little legs moving quickly through the wet grass. Her smile was like sunshine breaking through the clouds, a reminder that no matter how difficult life got, there was always something worth fighting for. "Daddy, where were you?" "I missed you," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist as he stepped out of the truck. "I missed you too, sweetheart," Jack replied, his voice soft with emotion. "But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." As they walked inside together, Jack held on to that feeling, the one that kept him moving forward, even when he didn't have the answers. Being a father, being there for Emma, this was what mattered most. It was what he had fought for, and it was what kept him alive, kept him going. The world may have been full of chaos and uncertainty, but in that moment, all that mattered was his daughter, the love they shared, and the promise he had made to always be there for her. 2 days after the wreck, Jack found himself sitting at a small diner with his daughter, Emma. The diner was cozy, with yellowed lights spilling from the overhead lamps, and the hum of conversation buzzing around them. Jack had grown fond of the place. It was a safe haven of sorts, where the weight of his world felt just a little bit lighter. The friendly waitress knew his order by heart: coffee, black, and eggs with bacon on the side. Emma would always choose the pancakes, light, fluffy, and sweet just like her. As Jack sipped his coffee, watching Emma chatter about her day at school, he couldn't help but replay the events of the previous days in his mind. The rescue had been a whirlwind, a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Yet he couldn't shake the image of the biker, his broken body lying on the asphalt, helpless, while the world passed by. Jack didn't think about it much, but he felt the weight of it in his bones, a lingering ache that gnawed at him. Just as he was about to take another sip of his coffee, the door to the diner swung open. The bell above it jingled, a familiar sound, but this time the mood in the room shifted. People stopped mid-sentence, their conversations coming to an abrupt halt. Jack glanced up, unsure of what had caused the sudden tension in the air. A group of men walked in, their presence undeniable. The air around them seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the diner. Leather vests adorned their broad shoulders, each one stitched with symbols, skulls, flames, and names whispered with both fear and respect. Jack didn't need to ask who they were. He knew. The Hells Angels. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Jack's eyes narrowed instinctively, his hand moving to Emma's shoulder, his protective instincts kicking in. He had no idea what they wanted, but he knew one thing. These weren't men you ignored. They were the kind of men who commanded respect with their mere presence. One of them, a giant of a man, moved toward Jack's table. His face was rough, worn by years of hard living. His skin was weathered, like old leather, and his braided beard hung down to his chest. He looked like he had been carved from stone. As he approached, Jack's heart began to race, but he didn't let it show. He kept his hand on Emma's shoulder, ready for anything. The man stopped at their table, his shadow looming over them. Jack instinctively tensed, preparing for a confrontation, but instead, the biker did something unexpected. He removed his sunglasses slowly and leaned forward. His voice, deep and gravelly, broke the silence. "You're the one who pulled our brother out of the wreck," the man said. His words were heavy with respect, and Jack could hear the reverence in his voice. Jack blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone to be acknowledged by a group like this. He nodded, unsure of what to say. I just did what needed to be done," Jack replied, his voice steady, though a little uncertain. He still didn't fully understand why this was happening. The biker's expression softened. "He's alive because of you," he said, his tone still reverent, but now with a hint of gratitude. He nodded once, and one by one the other men stood behind him. There was no grand speech, no shouting. Just a quiet, unspoken understanding. The entire diner watched in stunned silence as the Hells Angels, known for their fearsome reputation and chaotic lifestyle, stood in respectful solidarity. They didn't speak, but their actions spoke louder than words ever could. One by one they saluted Jack, silent but powerful. Jack could feel the weight of their gaze on him, and his chest tightened. It wasn't fear but something else. Something that felt unfamiliar but oddly comforting. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with wonder. The man they had been taught to fear, the man whose name was whispered with dread in every corner of town, was now standing in silent respect for her father. She had never seen anything like this, and Jack could feel her confusion in the way her small hand gripped his arm. "Daddy, are they protecting us?" she asked, her voice soft, tinged with awe. Jack smiled faintly, his hand gently brushing her hair. "They're saying thank you, sweetheart," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know what else to say because, in that moment, that's exactly what it felt like. They were saying thank you. The Hells Angels didn't stay long. They didn't linger to cause trouble or make a scene. After that simple act of respect, they turned and left the diner as quietly as they had entered, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. The sounds of conversation slowly returned to the room, but there was an unspoken shift in the air. Something had changed and Jack could feel it. From that day on, Jack never ate alone at the diner. The Hells Angels didn't wear their vests or their patches in the diner, but they always made sure Jack had company. They would come in, order their food, and sit quietly at their tables, casting occasional glances in his direction. They were there, but in a way that felt more like silent guardianship than anything else. Jack didn't ask for it. He didn't need it. But there was something profoundly comforting about knowing that, in a world that often seemed indifferent, there were people, however unlikely, who respected him. And not just because of his past or his military service, but because he had done what was right when no one else would. Because he had chosen to be a hero, even if only for one stranger, one biker, one moment. The days that followed were quieter, but they didn't feel empty. Jack spent more time with Emma, more time at the diner, and more time reflecting on everything that had happened. Life had a way of moving on whether we were ready for it or not. The storm had passed, but in Jack's heart, the calm that followed was different from what he had known before. There was a peace, yes, but also a weight, a new understanding of his place in the world. As he sat in the diner one evening watching Emma play with the sugar packets at their booth, Jack couldn't shake the memory of the Hells Angels. The biker who had spoken to him, the silent salute from the others, the way the entire room had shifted, it wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was a moment of recognition. A moment where Jack had done something that had mattered, something that had caused ripples in a world that often felt indifferent to the struggles of ordinary people. The Hells Angels were a world apart from the life Jack had built. They were a brotherhood bound by loyalty, fear, and respect, a world of chaos, violence, and an unspoken code of honor. Jack had no place in that world. He didn't belong to their group, didn't share their lifestyle. But for a brief moment, they had acknowledged him as one of their own. They had seen something in him, something that went beyond his scars, beyond the pain and exhaustion that had shaped him. They had seen the man who had refused to look away when a stranger needed help. Jack had often wondered if anyone truly saw him. Not just the man who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, not just the father who always seemed to be running on empty, but the man who had fought through battles both on foreign soil and in the quiet corners of his own soul. That man, he had always been there, but Jack had never given him the recognition he deserved. Now, for the first time, someone else had recognized him. And it wasn't the kind of recognition that came from accolades or public applause. It wasn't a reward for bravery or heroism, it was simply respect. The kind of respect that only came from shared experience, from understanding what it meant to stand in the face of danger and to act without thinking because it was the right thing to do. "Dad, when do we get to visit the zoo again?" Emma's voice broke Jack out of his reverie. She was staring up at him with wide eyes, her hands still clutching the sugar packets as she waited for his answer. Jack smiled at her, his heart softening as he looked at his daughter. "Soon, sweetheart," he said, reaching across the table to ruffle her hair. "Soon we'll go. I promise." It was these little moments that kept him grounded, Emma's laughter, her curiosity, the way she made everything seem possible, even when the world outside felt heavy and uncertain. Jack had made promises to her, promises to keep her safe, to always be there for her no matter what. And while he knew he couldn't shield her from everything, he could give her something important, a legacy of courage and kindness. The Hells Angels had given Jack more than just recognition. They had given him a deeper understanding of what it meant to live with purpose. In their quiet, respectful way, they had shown him that sometimes, it wasn't the grand gestures or the loud proclamations that made a difference. Sometimes, it was the small, silent acts of heroism, the ones that no one else saw, that truly defined who we were. Jack didn't wear a leather vest or a patch. He wasn't part of any brotherhood. He had no colors to show. But he didn't need them. The respect he had earned wasn't based on what he wore or what group he belonged to. It was based on who he was, a man who chose to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy, even when no one else was watching. Days turned into weeks, and Jack began to notice small changes in the way people treated him. It wasn't just the bikers anymore, it was the regulars at the diner, the people in his neighborhood. There was a quiet recognition in their eyes, a newfound respect. They didn't know everything about him, they didn't know the struggles he faced, the battles he had fought, but they saw the man who had chosen to act, to help a stranger in need without hesitation. For Jack, it wasn't about the respect though. It wasn't about recognition or admiration. It was about the quiet pride that came from knowing he had done the right thing. It was about the legacy he was building, not just for himself but for Emma. He wanted her to grow up knowing that being brave didn't mean being fearless. It meant doing what was right even when it was hard. It meant standing up when no one else would, even if that meant standing alone. One afternoon, as Jack was finishing his shift at the convenience store, he found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The man who had once been consumed by his own doubts and fears, the man who had carried the weight of his past on his shoulders, was starting to understand something important. He didn't have to carry everything alone. Jack had spent years feeling like he was on his own. He had lived in the shadows of his past, fighting battles that no one knew about, keeping his head down, hoping for something better. But now, after everything he had been through, the wreck, the bikers, the quiet respect he had earned, he realized that he wasn't alone anymore. He had Emma. He had the respect of those around him, even if it wasn't something he had ever sought out. In that moment, Jack understood that the true meaning of family was more than just blood. It was about loyalty, about standing up for each other when the world seemed to turn its back. And in a world that often felt unforgiving, that was the greatest gift he could give Emma, a family built on respect, love, and the courage to do what was right.